What Really Happened with your host, Mike Rivero. You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, where you'll find out what the Fukushima's going on.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 3, and we're being a little bit delayed connecting with Greg Felton. So while we work out those technical issues, a couple more news stories from the world of computers. Apparently, there's been this big, huge problem over at Google where their corporate culture is intensely liberal, and apparently there has been serious misconduct toward conservatives, which was made public. And it makes Google look bad. All that money spent on the internship to make Google look like it's the greatest place on earth to work, and it was just destroyed. But apparently a senior vice president at Google is promising to act against all employees who raise their voices against the company's pattern of misconduct toward its conservative personnel. Okay, we have Greg on the line right now. So joining us is Greg Felton. He's an author, and he's written a lot of books. I'm looking at his Amazon page here right now. Books like Enemies by Design, Inventing the War on Terror, Exploding Middle East Myths, and, of course, his new one, The Host and the Parasite. So, Greg, thank you for spending time with us today, and tell us about your new book.
Well, first of all, one slight correction, the Enemies by Design, that was published without my permission. I had written it with a publisher who behaved rather unethically, so I divorced myself from it. I restructured it and reissued it as The Host and the Parasite, How Israel's Fifth Column Consumed America. It's now out in 3rd edition, and it can be found at thehostandtheparasite.com. It has its own website. Okay. And it incorporates the development or the decline of the United States into neo-fascism through the Obama and Trump years. So this brings you right up to Donald Trump, and it explains how he came to power. So everything here is predictable, and one of the interesting things about current American political language, to the extent that it even exists, is that many people look at Donald Trump as the beginning of the end of America, that he's this horrible, bombastic, racist, misogynist, blah, blah, corrupt, cronyistic politician that is sort of the start of something, but it isn't. Donald Trump is the end result of a long series of degenerative presidents that begins more or less with Ronald Reagan. And in fact, Donald Trump's presidency could have been predicted up to a point because when he won the leadership of the party in 2016, the Republican Party had ceased to exist in any intellectual sense. It had essentially committed intellectual suicide. Any genuine conservatives had been pushed out and been replaced by neocons. Yes. And Donald Trump represents the recognition that the party had become brain dead. As I say in my book, he just had to step over the corpses. There was no one left to challenge him. He beat more than a dozen professional politicians for the leadership. And that tells you how bankrupt, intellectually bankrupt, the Republican Party had become. So the book tells you a little bit about how that happened and how and why Hillary Clinton lost the Democratic nomination as well.
You mean when in Obama's second term?
Well, the thing is, after Obama's second term, Hillary Clinton was the anointed successor. And
yes,
what she was Israel's candidate. She was essentially a treasonous implant in the Democratic Party. But the fact that she lost the election is truly astounding, because essentially it was fixed for her to win. The press savaged Donald Trump. They ignored Bernie Sanders. They skewed their reporting to favor Clinton. They suppressed anti-Clinton news. Yes. They tried to make her look human when she's little more than a female cyborg that serves business interests like Goldman Sachs and the other banksters, whom she admitted she represented when she was senator. So you look at how this happened and how Clinton could not win the election. And this is, again, for the Democratic Party, a symptom of the Zionization of America and how the United States has become little more than an Israeli-occupied satrapy. And this is the one thing I want people to realize from my book is that the United States does not exist as an independent country. It hasn't existed as an independent country, at least since Ronald Reagan. And The Host and the Parasite tells you how this happened and how it was done with open eyes.
Yeah, most of us who are listening to this show, we've watched this happen, certainly paying attention with Obama, and we're well aware that Israel is just basically openly contemptuous of the American people. They hate the Bill of Rights, and what's really alarming is how many members of our government are willing to go along with ridiculous laws that are clearly unconstitutional. Now, some judges are starting to push back. This idea that in order to get a job that you have to pledge you will never boycott or criticize Israel, that absolutely is a violation of our First Amendment rights, and the courts are starting to say that. But again, you have to wonder, how does Israel get this kind of control over our government? Now, obviously, there's going to be just outright financial support. We know that AIPAC carries a huge amount of clout, and they have large amounts of money that they can spend. And some of that money basically circulates around a bit, but it originates with the money that Congress votes to give Israel. So it's almost like a kickback scheme. The more Congress votes to give Israel things, the more AIPAC will reward those members of Congress. And it's just endless corruption. Then you have to add in the possibility of blackmail. We know that Israeli companies have penetrated strategically important systems in our country. If we go on back to Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, apparently Israel somehow was getting recordings of Bill and Monica's phone sex sessions, and they used to use those to blackmail Bill into ordering the FBI to stop the search for Israel's top spy inside the administration, codenamed Mega. It's just amazing how much control Israel has and how readily our politicians are just okay with going along with that, even those who are not of Jewish descent or dual citizens.
It is truly astounding, and I think there's an excellent book to be written on how a minority population in the United States, the Jewish population, not all Jew, but most, I would say, back in 48, a minority of Jews, managed to co-opt the government. And there's a lot of different influences, but again, you're quite right. Money is the main one. If you take money out of politics, the Zionist lobby loses its lever, its main lever. And it can't coerce, it can't bribe, it can't blackmail politicians into behavior. Matter of fact, if I remember my history, in 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, in which Israel was facing serious military defeat, Israel's government threatened to use nuclear weapons unless America resupplied Israel with jet fighters. So blackmail is one of the great instruments of Israeli terrorism. For example, every congressman or senator has to sign a pledge to support Israel. Otherwise, their districts will get no funding. And this is grossly unconstitutional. People go along with it because they know that Israel is so ruthless. It can, at some degree, it will have you killed. It will have you marginalized. Yes. It will not support you. The press, which is bought and paid for by pro-Israel lobbyists, pro-Israel supporters, will smear you. Bernie Sanders was vilified to the extent that he was written about in the press. He was some sort of socialist. He wasn't. Well, he's an American firster, which makes him a socialist. And I guess it's easy to go along with the Zionists rather than to buck them, because you're up against an institution, you're up against a permanent government of Zionists. And this goes back to 1948 when Harry Truman took his famous $2 million bribe to support the creation, and I use that word in quotes, state of Israel, because the Congress at the time, the Senate, was thoroughly pro-Zionist. The American public was pro-Zionist out of some ridiculous sympathy for the Jews of World War II. I mean, you have to go back to the Holocaust propaganda that gave the Israelis its moral billy club with which to bludgeon people over the head to support Israel. Mm-hmm. There's religious reasons why. I mean, the rabid Christians look upon Jews as some sort of religious kin, and the Muslims are the enemy because they came after Jesus and they don't think Jesus is the Son of God. A lot of it is irrational. A lot of it is self-serving. And because Jews have a lot of influence in banking and other lobby groups, and they're very persuasive, and they pander to people's insecurities, they have managed to build themselves a solid network of influence. It's like if Al Capone had been as strong as the Israeli lobby, we would be living under gangsterism.
I think we already are. But not really because of Al Capone.
Are you there?
Yes, you're still on the air.
So it's a great story to see how a small group of people can take over a country. It really is.
It is. I think if you look at Israel's strident demands of the United States, they seem to take a real jump right around 9/11. And we know there are indications that Israel and the U.S. Intelligence agencies worked together to create 9/11. There were those dancing Israelis who were arrested. They were cheering as the towers came down. Turned out 3 of those were Mossad. And I think partnering with Israel on something like this was probably one of the biggest mistakes our government ever made, because Israel just turned right around and they blackmailed the U.S. government with the 9/11. Give us what we want here, or we'll tell the world what really happened on 9/11, and it'll be worse for the U.S. than for Israel because, hey, Israel expects everybody expects Israel to do this kind of thing. But for the U.S. government, it will be very, very damaging. And it seems like ever since 9/11, there isn't anything that Israel has asked for they have not gotten, including this recent declaration by Donald Trump that we recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Well, I would say
look at all the trouble that caused.
Well, yeah, that was essentially the most absurd thing that Trump could have done, because it has no upside for the United States, zero upside. And it confirms what you said, that Israel has a deep and abiding contempt for American interests and American integrity. But I would make one qualification about September the 11th. The government that was in place at the time of September the 11th, I do not consider to be an American government. In my book, The Host and the Parasite, I talk about it. I refer to it as the Bush junta, because the Project for the New American Century, which is the foundation of that government, was openly treasonous. It had no interest in supporting American interests. It was thoroughgoing pro-Israel. And
yes.
If you look, so you look at the people who did that. It could not have been done without the collusion of the government. And there was no rational reason to allow the World Trade Centers to be demolished like that and the Pentagon to be attacked, unless you were serving the one government that could have benefited from it, and that was the Israeli government. It did not benefit the U.S. at all. The U.S. has no need to go in and bomb Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, anything like this. This is all part of the Zionist plan, the Yinon plan, which goes back to the early 80s, and Oded Yinon, who was a journalist, described the long-term objectives of Israel, which was to bring down certain governments. And America has been the instrument of Israeli terrorism ever since. So I think it's important to recognize that George Bush, or I call it the Cheney government, really, because Bush really didn't have the brains to run the government. This was Cheney's doing. Cheney was the criminal. Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and a host of other smaller people were responsible for allowing the World Trade Centers to be attacked. And this is what they needed to justify the suspension of the Constitution and the passage of the USA Patriot Act. And we know this to be certain because the USA Patriot Act was written 3 weeks before the 9/11 events occurred. It was written by Philip Zelikoff, who was the propagandist for the Bush junta in the first draft. So you've got to wonder, how could you write a document about an event that hadn't happened yet? So it clearly demonstrates that the World Trade Center was a planned false flag attack. And anybody who buys into the official story either doesn't want to know or is in the business of propounding the official fiction.
I agree. I absolutely agree. Yeah. And it does seem, I mean, I remember when the Project for the New American Century was setting up shop, and it was all neocons and very clearly pro-Israel. In fact, some of the documents that were at their website were directed at the Israeli government. And it was very obvious that they were the force behind the Bush administration's war agenda and just getting us into all this trouble all over the globe. But at this point, we're kind of worn out. We're sucked dry. And there's a real chance that we could collapse. And Israel, I'm sure, is already picking out their next target to be their host. They may go across the border into Canada or some other country. And I'm sure to some extent or another, they're playing these same games in other countries. We know throughout history they were doing the same thing in any countries where they lived. They would intentionally go into those areas of commerce where they would exert control over the rest of society until finally some countries literally would pass laws saying that Jews were not allowed to get into this and that activity because of the abuses that followed. And again, it's a very predatory culture. It's unfortunately part of their religion. And they see themselves as automatically superior, automatically entitled. Everybody else is inferior, and worse, they're fair game. My first wife was Jewish, and she was out there explaining that the Ten Commandments only apply to other Jews, and everybody else is fair game. And when she first told me that, I honestly thought she was, playing a joke on me. But it turned out that really was what she believed. Okay.
Yeah, it is true. It is rather appalling to think that Jews can think of themselves, but that they do think themselves entitled, that they're above the law, that that everybody has to serve the Jewish people, that they're chosen. I call it a sort of a psychopathology of Judaism. The religion does essentially teach people to be inhuman, to be criminal, and I think it could be recognized as a form of mental illness if you think that you're chosen by God and you have the right to murder, torture, steal, and otherwise abuse other human beings. It's rather sad, but the problem is there's one thing about Judaism that I think is attractive to a lot of people, and I think this goes into the psychopathology of bullying in general. If you can think of yourself as better than anybody else, if you can find a belief system that can elevate you above the masses, above the herd, you might want to gravitate toward it because it makes you feel better about yourself. You see yourself as above everybody else. And I think there is a real attractiveness to that. Can you just hold on 1 second, please?
Yeah, I certainly can here. And if Tony in Puerto Rico is still on the phone line, let's go ahead and take that phone call while Greg steps away. Tony, are you there? You just dropped him. Okay, well, that was my bad. Okay, well, while Greg steps away for doing what he's going to do, Facebook.
I'm here. Okay.
Oh, you're here. Okay.
Yeah.
We're actually coming up now on a commercial break. It'll be a 3-minute break. And when we come on back, I'd like you to sort of pick up where you left off and maybe shift the focus back more to the political than the religious. So we're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be back with Greg Felton after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're talking with Greg Felton about his book, The Host and the Parasite. Apparently, we got a call from Frank in North Carolina saying, thank you so much for telling the unvarnished truth. And before we get back to Greg, Fox News is running a story about this law that is being passed in Poland. We're going to go ahead and open up the phone lines again, but only on the topic of Greg's book here. But right now, Fox News is running this story about this law that has been passed in Poland that basically says if you're going to talk about the history of World War II, use the word Nazi, don't use the word Polish, because apparently Poland was very upset that people were going to some of these slave labor camps and saying this was a Polish slave labor camp. No, they were built and operated by the Nazis. And Israel, of course, is just absolutely hopping mad, saying, no, the Poles did terrible things to us as well. It wasn't just the Nazis. Everybody was in cahoots to get us back then. And so they're literally demanding that they're trying to guilt Poland to get something out of them. And this has really gone on way too long, because the vast majority of people alive today were born after all of that was over. And I refuse to feel guilty about anything that is outside of my control, certainly anything that happened before I was born. And yet Israel keeps trying to milk this over and over and over again. And apparently they're so manic about it. The fact that Poland wants to identify the Nazis as committing the alleged crimes on Polish soil, and then Israel comes back and say, no, you bear the guilt. I think it's very revealing to as to what the mindset is.
Oh, you're quite right. It's amazing. I mean, if anybody knows anything about what happened in World War II, it's the Polish government. And since the Polish government now superintends the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp facility, they know, I would submit, considerably more about what happened than the Jews of Israel do. As a matter of fact, the Polish government reduced the amount of estimated dead at Auschwitz-Birkenau from 4 million to 1.5 million. And they did so through proper editing and analysis of records of people who passed through there. So that means officially we need to take 2.5 million off of the official dead count, which would bring it down to 3.5 million, not the apocryphal 6 million. And this is one of the things I think that gets up the nose of the Israelis. I mean, if we allow Poland to have any say in this, then we lose control over the narrative. And Israel has to blame everybody for the suffering of the Jews, because, as we all know, Jews are the only people who ever suffer. And, we see this also in the book by Daniel Stern Goldhagen, who wrote a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners, in which he blamed the entire entire German people for what Hitler did. And that's a sort of collective guilting that is evidenced today in what Netanyahu is doing regarding Poland. I support the Poles. The Poles are right. And the fact that Israel is behaving so irrationally, it tells me that they have no sensible grounds for opposing this, and it's just emotionalism. Eventually, I think
I would agree.
Yeah.
I would agree on that. But you need to remember that 6 million is again a religious origin, that there is this prophecy that after the Jews have lost 6 million, the Messiah will come, the third temple will be built, and all will be well. They were using that same number in World War I propaganda. The 6 million Jews of Europe are suffering and starving. Please send money. And what's really interesting, of course, is going back to Germany in World War II. It's hard to see where the 6 million came from because there were only a few 100,000 Jews in Germany at the start of World War II. And census records don't show a major population decline at the end of World War II.
As a matter of fact, first of all, the 6 million figure dates at least to the year 1900. That's the first mention I have of it. It gets mentioned in the New York Times, the Pittsburgh Criterion, a host of other newspapers. The 6 million Jews come from either Romania, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus. I mean, the 6 million is thrown out so much that you have about 10 to 20 times the number of Jews that actually existed, all dying or being killed. It's ridiculous. It's utterly apocryphal. It has no basis, in fact. And it doesn't. No.
And the other thing to keep in mind, I'm sorry to cut you off here. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that these were slave labor camps, And it wasn't just Jews in there. There were Poles, there were gypsies, the mentally retarded, gays were in there. And so the Jewish population in these slave labor camps was a minority population. And yet the entire portrayal of the slave labor camps is that they were specifically targeted on the Jews. And that is not historically supportable.
No, and I don't know if the Jews were the minority or the majority, but I can say for certain that the figure 6 million was never attested to by anything. Even Adolf Eichmann, who when interviewed by Hannah Arendt would admit to only 2 million, and he would know, I would think. He had no reason to lie.
Well, Greg, we have to take another break for commercials. This will be a 4-minute break, and when we come on back, we've got a caller waiting on the line. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with Greg Felton. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And we're getting callers at RBN. I'm getting emails here from people who are just, well, some are very supportive. Thank you for talking about the reality. Others are saying, oh, you're a Jew hater, blah, 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 blah. There's one thing for everybody listening to the show to keep in mind. Think about how we have been lied to by our government for all this time. They lied about Saddam's nuclear weapons. They lied about Assad's sarin gas. They lied about the Boston Marathon bombing, Sandy Hook, all of that stuff. Do you really think being lied to on a massive, continuous basis began recently? No. It's as old as civilization itself. All rulers tell gigantic lies to their population to gain control over them. Ramses told the people of Egypt he'd beat the Hittites, knowing that the people of Egypt couldn't find out that he'd actually almost lost his army. I mean, that's it. Governments lie to their people, and the government of Israel is no different than anybody else. All right, we're going to take a couple of phone calls here. Chuck in Texas, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, Michael, thank you very much for having this gentleman on. I was just jumped on my computer to order his book. I've got a question. Well, we understand that Hillary would have been worse. Let's get that straight first off and foremost. Yes, Hillary would have been worse. However, in watching what this president is doing, the opinion of the host would matter to me. Is this guy possibly the last real American president or an American president that we're going to have? Seeing the move that he made, kneeling to Israel and igniting the Middle East against our troops that are already there. Have we totally lost control of our government?
Well, the answer is yes, I'm afraid so. I think what I find interesting about Donald Trump is that when he was a candidate, he spoke against American adventurism in the Middle East, wasteful wars that cost trillions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives. And he sounded like somebody who was going to put a check on the Zionist agenda that basically drives the Democratic Party. But recently, as you have seen, Trump has turned into sort of an anti-Trump. He has been co-opted by the very establishment he ran against. And since Donald Trump doesn't have any real qualifications for being president, he's essentially a bombastic man-child. That's the way I see it. He really doesn't have the background to stand up to them. He's easily persuaded and manipulated, and I think he is essentially he has lost control of his government. That's what I think has happened.
Well, I find myself in disagreement with a lot of friends that I've had for a very long time whenever I say it's time to dump Trump to get back the resistance. Because as long as Trump is there, we have these people who are just enamored with him no matter what we say, and they're just like Obamites. And I say, let them take him out of office to get our resistance back. Our resistance in the United States has absolutely evaporated, resistance being against our government in general and tyranny, but they put the face of Obama on it. But whenever Trump came in, all of a sudden it just evaporated. And that's my concern.
Well, I would agree that Trump has to go, but the danger, though, is, and Ray McGovern, who's a former CIA agent, he made the correct point, is that if you get rid of Trump, you get Mike Pence. And Mike Pence is immeasurably worse. And I say that because Trump is obviously bombastic and incompetent. Mike Pence is very slick, professional, and he would give the illusion of competence. But he is religiously psychopathic. He is a devout Christian, and he has no trouble waging war for Israel. I think Trump is more reluctant to do it, but I don't think he has the backbone to stand up to the deep state, which is essentially run by Democrats. I don't think getting rid of Trump now is the right idea. Yeah.
Well, if we don't, then the next president, and there's no way that Trump is going to win a second term.
I agree.
It's going to be Pence anyway. And during this time, we're watching the NSA. Everything that we really used to watch under Obama is still continuing under Trump in spades, and everyone's like, "Oh, it's okay because Trump has the trigger finger." So to me, when do we finally say we've had enough? And I'm with Mike. I don't want a violent revolution, but I've given up on every other avenue we have to avoid it.
Well, you're quite right.
I'm going to go ahead and sign off because I know there's other callers. Mike, thanks for letting me come on the show, and thank you so much for having this gentleman on.
All right. Well, you're welcome on both counts, and we'll have Greg Felton back again because I'm getting a lot of positive response in the email to him. We're going to now move to James in Ohio. Aloha, James. Do you have a question for our guest?
Yeah, I was wondering if he was aware of the fact that the instructions for Zyklon B indicate that it takes from 1 to 3 days to release the small amount of hydrogen cyanide that is absorbed into it, and also that there have been a couple people who have done videos where they've sat in a nearly airtight phone booth-sized enclosure with a can of Zyklon B poured out on the floor for over an hour, and I would happily do so myself, and I know a lot about toxicology, but the story told to the visitors of the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. is that the Germans poured a can of Zyklon B through an open hole in the ceiling of the so-called gas chamber, and in 15 minutes, the screaming was over. Also, cyanide poisoning often produces convulsions to the point where the spine and the long bones break, and there is time for huge swelling to occur before death. But these symptoms are noticeably absent in pictures of so-called Holocaust.
Well, first of all, Zyklon B is actually an insecticide. It's used for killing lice. And the reason it was there at the slave labor camps toward the end of the war was when the Germans were basically pushed back out of Russia, they brought with them typhus, or possibly the Russians had deliberately infected them with typhus as a biological weapon. And so they were basically using the Zyklon B to kill the body lice that was carrying the disease from person to person. And that included not just the inmates in the camps, it included the staff and the guards, their clothing. Everything was being soaked in this to try and prevent the typhus from spreading any further. So that's one misconception that's out there. It's not that powerful on humans, and you're right. One can wouldn't do it. It was a fumigant, and it did take a long time to release the chemical. And the other aspect of it is that a lot of these rooms that are claimed to have been execution chambers using Zyklon B, the wall should be colored blue because cyanide is a stain. That's where the pigment cyan comes from.
Ferrocyanide.
Yep.
The staining mixing with iron produces ferrocyanide, which has a really blue color. It's called Prussian blue. But that's all I had for you. Thank you very much for having your guest on. I appreciate it very much, and I'll let you go now. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much here, and we're going to take another phone call. This is from Francis in North Carolina.
Michael, 1 second.
What?
One thing.
Okay.
Also, your guest is perfectly correct. Your caller was very well informed. But what's also interesting is that these so-called gas chambers, which of course never existed, those holes through which the Zyklon B was allegedly dropped, they were added after the war by the Soviet Union for propaganda purposes. There were no holes through which that gas could have been dropped. And one of Hollywood's greatest disgraces is the film Denial, which manufactures false history to implicate David Irving in the libel. Mm-hmm. He charged Deborah Lipstadt with 5 counts of libel. Lipstadt, and he won 4 of the 5 cases against her. Only one he didn't win, and that was elaborated and blown out of all proportion. And that's what the basis of the movie is. And in the movie, they falsify history by putting those holes on the top of those barracks, but they were never there during World War II. That was after the fact. So history has been falsified.
The Russians also added that large crematorium that tourists are shown that the Nazis used to dispose of the bodies that didn't exist back then. That was added by the Soviets after the war was over to dispose of the typhus-infected bodies. And by the way, if you look at those photos of all the emaciated prisoners, any doctor will tell you they're showing the symptoms of typhus. That's why they were thin and emaciated, because typhus, you get intense diarrhea, you can't take in nutrients, and that's what was going on. It was a major typhus epidemic across Germany. Anyway, let's go on and take another phone call. We're finally going to get to Francis in North Carolina. Aloha, Francis. What's on your mind today?
Hello, aloha to you, both you fellas. I have a question for you as far as perception or perspective is concerned, and for a lot of people it may be viewed as a lame question. For others, it's not. 6 million, okay, you have a figure of 6 million people. Okay, what state in the U.S. would be about the size required to fit 6 million people into, as far as perception goes?
I don't quite understand. How to fit 6 million people into a state? The figure is false to be. The figure is false to begin with, though. I don't know why you'd want to do that.
I'll give you that but just for the sake of statistical size.
I think where Francis is going is that she's saying that none of these camps were large enough to even hold 6 million people.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay. Well, we don't know whether they came in at one time or whether they were just filtered throughout and some died and they kept bringing new ones in. The whole point is, and Francis makes a very good point, by the way, by bringing this up, you could not physically kill 6 million people in these chambers. It could not be done because there wasn't the technology to kill that, to incinerate that many people. And when you figure that the number of Jews that were carted off to the concentration camps was not constant throughout World War II, that it was accelerated after about sometime in 1944, when the Germans realized they were losing the war, that's when the train started moving faster and faster to Auschwitz and Theresienstadt and other places. So you'd have
because they were factories. They were prison factories that were manufacturing materials for the German army. That's where that stuff all came from, and that's another reason why the Nazis they actually looked after the health of the inmates very much. There were doctors on staff. There were health clubs. They had swimming pools they could exercise in because they were valuable commodities supporting the German war effort. And that again, slavery is wrong. But these camps were prison factories, just like the prison factories we have in the United States today.
Indeed.
Exactly.
I think basically what I was trying to express was, shall we say, misexpressed as far as proportionate to what size of a state is concerned and what one would fit 6 million people into. Not that was the scenario, but I think that how I conveyed it was not exactly well done to get the point across how big of an area that would have been, since a lot of the people, as you stated, were coming in from different directions or whatever have you. as a culmination is what I was getting at. But aside from that, the fact that they're giving such a hissy fit over this, I've yet to learn of one ethnic background that did not experience some sort of a, if you want to call it a Holocaust, or an ethnic cleansing, or degradation, for that matter, throughout the aspect of human history. What ethnic background has never experienced that? And I've yet to know of one as of yet.
Well, you
have a great one.
Yeah, the Armenians, the Ukrainians, for example, they were all slaughtered by, respectively, the Turks and the Russians. There was the extermination of, for many in the United States, of many native peoples. In Europe, millions of non-Christians were slaughtered because they wouldn't buy into the Jesus cult. You're right. History is full of misery. As Hegel said in one of his more sober moments, history is a slaughter bench. And the Jews are not the only people to have suffered, clearly, but they want the world to think that's true so they can justify the creation of Israel as some alleged national home for Jews, which, of course, it was never created legally, and Israel even lied its way into the United Nations.
Well, the other part to keep in mind here is that, again, Israel uses that image of perpetual victim, again, to extort money or guilt other countries out of more money. But the Jews, again, they have not really suffered out of proportion compared to other groups around the world or throughout history. It's just an image they sell, that they're somehow being gratuitously picked on, and that therefore the rest of the world owes them some kind of compensation. And as I said earlier in the show, I refuse to accept responsibility for things that are outside of my control, and certainly those things that happened before I was born. We've got time for one more phone call. Jeff in Georgia, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yes, good to talk to you. Good to talk to listen to this person. I just want to point out the Jewish control has been in our government long before Reagan. It was manipulating Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt. It helped overthrow, the coup d'etat of Kennedy had Jewish, the cartel behind all that. They practically ran with a hidden hand the Johnson administration, the soft coup of Nixon. You're never going to win the argument on the Holocaust. Or talk about good things Nazis did. We're not going to win that. I would like to know what Gregory thinks we have to do to overthrow this, is so that, for the benefit of all people in this country.
Okay, well, Jeff, we have to take a break for commercials. We're going to let you go, and when we come back for the last segment of our program, Greg can answer that question. So we'll be back after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Final segment of our program today. We're not taking any more phone calls. And Greg, Jeff asked a good question. What do we do? We all know what's going on. We are living under a Vichy government, puppet rulers. And just like the United States is doing that to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, the people there don't like it. Why should we be any more accepting of it? And what do we do?
Well, tactically, one thing you could do is be careful of your terminology. Now, inasmuch as I can agree with Jeff that the Jews have had an inordinate influence on the United States, it is tactically wise not to blame Jews collectively or generically, because that invites the calumny, the empty slander of anti-Semitism, which is, of course, a nonsense term that was invented by a German in 1873. I would recommend you use the word Zionist or Israel firster. Make sure you focus on Israel, not Jews, because there are many Jews that are not Zionist. And a lot of the great people would be like Neve Gordon, Tanya Reinhardt, Norman Finkelstein, Alain Papé, Tony Ute, Amara Haas. There are lots of great Jews that do not buy into the cult of the Zionist, to buy into the Zionist atrocities that Israel commits. So a lot of Jews, oddly enough, are some of the best allies you could have. And Netanyahu
I have quite a few here at the website.
Yes, that's true. As a matter of fact, Netanyahu has no use for American Jews. because he doesn't need them because they're already Jewish, and he's not going to listen to their complaints because they're just very important complaints, and he can't deal with them because how do you criticize a Jew who criticizes Israel? Which is why Israelis need the Zionists, the Christian Zionists, the psychopaths who have no compunction about committing mass murder in the name of a religious fiction. So be careful not to overstate your enemy. Use language wisely and with discretion. The second thing to do is write. Talk to people. Use the court system. And Kansas recently, a judge ruled against the draconian anti-BDS legislation. That is something that use the court system as much as possible. The law can be used effectively, because if you simply retreat into your shell or simply scream at the wind, you're not going to accomplish anything. And this is why a lot of peace groups are really more destructive than anything else. Peace groups and people who complain a lot merely make a lot of noise, but they don't achieve anything. You need to learn how to channel your energies into effective resistance movements. And it might be useful to go into history and to see how other peoples behaved. During the Inquisition, where people criticized the Catholic Church, how did they survive? How did they not end up being tortured to death? How did Russians under Soviet rule manage to survive and not get sent to the gulags? How did the partisans of France survive during World War II? I mean, there are ways to look through history to see how you can behave like a guerrilla movements. Anyway, before I go, my book is The Host and the Parasite, How Israel's Fifth Column Consumed America. And you can buy it at thehostandtheparasite.com. And you can see how Donald Trump fits into the Zionization of America, which, as Jeff rightly pointed out, predates Ronald Reagan. I source it to Harry Truman. He's the first.
Okay.
Greg,
we're at the end of the show. I'm sorry to cut you off. We're at the end of the show.
No problem.
And there is an ad for the book on the front page of whatreallyhappened.com. So thank you, Greg. And we're going to turn the microphone over to John Stadmiller. We'll be back tomorrow with the Lady Claire. Aloha, America. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 3. And for some reason, we are unable to connect with our scheduled guest, Dan McGowan. We're trying to hunt him down. We're leaving voicemails and so forth and so on. So let's just open up the phone lines and let people start calling on in and talking about what they want to talk about, because I basically finished all my prepared talking points today. Okay. Now, I'm trying to get, okay, here we go. I'm going to send him an email and say that we're trying to reach you. Live radio's a lot of fun here. Okay. All right, we're going to send that one. Let's see. The number is 315-789-3524. That's the number I have. Okay. I don't know what's going on. All right. So close that down here. Get on back to some news. Okay. Apparently, boy, people are just getting downright rude here. Milo Yiannopoulos has been shouted out of a New York City bar by Democrats chanting, "Nazi scum, get out." Whatever happened to civility in public discourse? I mean, we're descending into mobocracy, where everybody's just shouting and screaming at each other and hurling insults. That's not the way to have a polite society here. Yeah, but apparently liberals are celebrating. Okay, we're going to take a phone call. Chris in Las Vegas, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, thank you so much, Michael. I thought I'd let you know I listened earlier to the Brand X channel of Mr. AJ, and he has a fairly frequent guest on there called Zach, who's a pretty deep-level Army intel guy that puts some pretty relevant and salient information on the radio over there quite frequently. He was headed out to Dubai this morning at San Francisco International Airport and was circumvented from his accessing the ticket area and spirited off to a inquisition room by the TSA and the Department of Homeland Security, and I think perhaps the FBI was also mentioned also. And he had a pair of external drives with him, I imagine terabyte or better, and he was traveling with another guy, and they were trying to claim that they thought he may have dangerous information or scandalous, embarrassing, or some other pretextual ruse to try to circumnavigate the warrant requirement to be able to obtain information from his private instruments and the equipment that he had with him. And so apparently he got hold of his attorney who intervened and was able to have the drive transferred to the attorney, and they're examining this, and he was supposed to be able to fly out later without the drives. But this individual's pretty high level on the intel, and apparently some of the stuff on there may have been things that were incriminating to Hitlery, the Comey and Mueller investigations, foreign arms trading and sex abuse and child trafficking and so on and so forth. So this was a fishing expedition trying to circumnavigate the warrant requirement based on probable cause of something they actually knew as to what they had a fear that might be. Of course, fear is fantasy envisioned as reality, and they are just on a fishing expedition and trying to circumvent the need to get a warrant.
Yeah, well, it does sound like that's what it is. It's a fishing expedition. And, TSA, Department of Homeland Security, tend to operate with this attitude of trying to bluff and bully you into going along with what they want to see. And you don't have to. Of course, they do have, the power to prevent you from getting on that airplane if you don't do what they tell you to do. But I'm glad this individual stood up for his rights. He contacted his lawyer. But again, when I travel, I have a specific machine I travel with because the TSA dropped and smashed a very expensive laptop of mine up in Seattle. And so when I travel, I leave my nice machines home, and I got this little tiny XP netbook, and all it does is mail and web browsing. There's nothing else on it at all. And if TSA and Department of Homeland Security want to waste their time going through it, fine and dandy, then there's nothing there. And so that's one way to handle it. But I understand there's a principle at work here, and that's called the Fourth Amendment. The government is not supposed to invade your privacy unless they have good reason to know that some criminal activity has taken place. This idea of it might be, we're concerned that you may be doing this, that's not good enough. That's absolutely not good enough.
You're precisely correct, Michael. My observation is the TSA and the Department of Homeland Security are really reiterations of the Nazi SS, the Stasi, the secret police, the brown shirts, if you will, and the Gestapo from Nazi Germany, reformed here in America under the so-called Prescott Bush's 10 United States Code 2358, the original Strom Thurmond National Defense Authorization Act of 1961. And this is where part of this stuff comes from. This is ancient Nazi stuff that was brought over here to America. Of course, it's given new lipstick on the pig and given new titles and labels so the American people won't clearly know what it is. But these are lawless agencies that have gone rogue, and they're absolutely prosecuting their own political agendas of assassinating and harassing, in fact, terrorizing Americans who have a perfect right to travel with their own private possessions, and are trying to break down every protection we have that we thought we had under our natural rights and those preserved in the Constitution. Thank you so much, Michael. Keep up the great work. Sunshine is the best stimulant for tyrannical governments. Thank you.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. Thank you very much for the phone call here. And we're apparently not able to connect with our guest today. I don't know what's happened. We're just getting voicemail on the phone line. I'd like to do a shout out to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network. And of course, callers are welcome to call on in and just talk about whatever they want to, as long as it's not, the kooky stuff. hollow Earth. For some reason, somebody's been sending me all this stuff about, the Earth is actually hollow, or the Earth is flat. That's the other new one that's out there. Everybody who says that the Earth is a ball is just, they're crazy. Well, Larry Klayman is out there, and he's saying that Rosenstein's biggest mistake is that he has furthered Mueller's crime to leak grand jury information and rubber stamp the raid on Michael Cohen's office. And at this point, it's becoming very, very obvious Mueller has gone way outside his brief. First of all, the way he was appointed, again, as we reported earlier in the show, there's no official intelligence behind the request for an investigation. Now, normally under Department of Justice rules, a special counsel is called only when a normal Department of Justice investigation has found indications a crime occurred. And that's when a special counsel gets appointed. Rosenstein just tapped Mueller and said, you're now the special counsel. You're looking into Trump's collusion with Russia. And Mueller found nothing. And so Rosenstein said, well, look for other things. Look for anything that you can find. It's a political witch hunt. And it really is time for it to end. I think probably most people agree with that. The part that I find most alarming are the liberal Democrats' threats to start riots if Trump fires Mueller. And the liberals think gun owners are the dangerous people. They really are behaving like children. They're just kicking and screaming if they don't get what they want. All righty, so let's see. We have a caller, Dr. Kelly in Northern California. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Great to speak with you today, and there are so many wonderful programs and outlets for this wisdom and knowledge, and I appreciate you as well, and always get a kick out of hearing from Chris near Las Vegas, and I would like to put something out about the grand jury reawakening and the desperate need for it in my neighboring state and Republic of Nevada and the California Republic, and as a way to get in at least at the county level for the local government watchdog that people have available to them, and would like to see Nevada kind of mirror that so that they can serve their people in the best way.
Well, I think the grand juries, unfortunately, tend to have been hijacked by the prosecutors and are more often than not used as a rubber stamp. And grand juries are supposed to follow their own lead, but very often they do not. But
they've done some pretty good work with recommending body-worn cameras for Nevada County deputy sheriffs, and they actually do have the body cameras in some of the local cities in the west side of Nevada County, California. And so a little bit of good, does come from those things. And it's really great to learn how to properly investigate things and look into them and see that, the highest order of law is the Constitution for the nation and then that particular republic. And then, statutory is number 3. And then the lowest are the opinions of the Attorney General.
Okay. I was not aware of that.
And, it's really amazing what can be done to serve. Now is the time, if people are interested, to apply. Now is the time to learn how to be a poll observer, poll watcher, poll worker, and get on a school board, get out there and serve your people.
Well, definitely we're going to need poll watchers this November. We know that there's massive election fraud in this country, but everybody should be involved in the government at one level or another. I tend to aim a little higher. as you can tell. But yeah, you need to be involved. I mean, if we're not watching the government, they're going to do dumb things, if not criminal things. I think a good example of that is right here in Hawaii with our light rail project, which is about as botched can be.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, Doctor.
So much.
All right, Dr. Kelly, I need to let you go. We finally connected with our guest, Dan McGowan. So, Dan, welcome to the show. Thank you for calling on in. We were about to put your face on a milk carton.
That's good. I've never been on a milk carton.
Well, you came very, very close this time. So, you are, if I understand correctly, the executive director of Dear Yassin Remembered. This is a Palestinian rights advocacy group. I think it's headquartered in Geneva. And why don't you just start by telling us what the organization is all about?
Sure. In 1948, just about 70 years ago, on April 9th, there was a massacre of Palestinian men, women, and children at a small village called Deir Yassin, which is on the west side of Jerusalem, right near the Holocaust Memorial today. And that particular massacre was emblematic of the dispossession of Palestinian people in 1948, the destruction of over 400 of their villages, and driving out of over 750,000 Palestinians from the area that was then became Israel a couple of weeks later on May 15th, 1948. And it's emblematic of it, and it's also a pivotal moment in Palestinian history. It's a massacre that every Palestinian has heard about and knows about, but it's a massacre that has largely been flushed down the memory hole as far as history in the United States is concerned, or even Israeli history. So in the mid-90s, we formed an organization to build a memorial at Deir Yassin, where today there's not even a signpost, not even a historical monument or marker. And we've been working ever since to commemorate that pivotal event, and ultimately working to build a memorial there in the shadow of the Holocaust Museum, the most famous Holocaust museum. There are hundreds of them. And, of course, it's in an effort to recognize the history of both sides of the conflict. In the United States, we dwell on the Israeli side, the Jewish side of the war, what they call the War of Independence, or what the Arabs call the catastrophe, or the Nakba. But today in Israel, in the lands controlled by Israel, over half the population is not Jewish. Most Americans are completely unaware of that. They think of Israel as mostly Jews, with maybe 20% Arabs. But that's not correct. The correct figure is that over half the population within the borders controlled by Israel, so that includes Gaza and the West Bank and the Golan Heights, in that area controlled by Israel, over half the population isn't Jewish. And their history, their dialogue, their narrative, we like to say in the academic world, is completely forgotten, particularly by Americans that have unwavering support for Israel. So if we're to gain peace in the area, the idea of two-state solution and so forth is passé today. There'll never be a two-state solution. But there should be, and as an American I would say, there should be one state with equal rights of citizenship, for all, and with equal recognition of the tragic history of both sides. That's the purpose, or the raison d'etre, of Dariusine Remembered.
Well, it seems to make a lot of sense to me, and we've observed on this show many times that, if Israel would simply grant to the Palestinians that which it demands for itself, a recognition of their right to exist, we could have avoided the last 70 years of constant tension and bloodshed and war. But it does seem that Israel has an attitude of good for me, bad for you, and I think this is another example. Israel wants their history put on out there. They want everybody else's history to be erased. And it's a very selfish attitude, unfortunately.
Yes, it is. And of course, the Holocaust has been the sword and shield of Israel. The Holocaust is the ultimate tragedy, or certainly portrayed as the ultimate tragedy, which Palestinians had no role in. They had nothing to do with the Holocaust. But they're paying for it because people who were dispossessed from Europe have, in large part, moved to their land and taken over their land, and taken over the water, and changed the language and controlled the area. And those Palestinians that are still living in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Israel itself have suffered greatly for it. Palestinians who live in Israel...
We're going to have to take a break. Dan, I'm sorry to cut you off. We got to take a break for commercials. We're going to be 3 minutes of commercials. We'll come right back to you after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking with Dan McGowan, and he's giving us a little bit of history lesson about just how Israel came to be in possession of Palestine. So, Dan, why don't you just pick up where you left off?
Sure. I was describing our organization called Dariusine Remembered. I didn't tell the listeners that the organization is half Jews, half non-Jews, and half men and half women. It's not a right-wing or a left-wing organization. It's certainly not an academic organization, because most of the academia, particularly here in the Northeast, are overwhelmingly on the left side of the spectrum.
Yes.
And overwhelmingly pro-Israel, to the point of actually being confrontational when any Palestinian history or the Palestinian side of the argument is introduced. I'm reminded of this attitude when I hear about the gassing in Syria a week ago, and how abhorrent it was for Americans that the Syrians would use gas, or blamed for using gas, or chemical weapons. At the same time, Israel used white phosphorus on the residents of Gaza only 8 years ago, and we had nothing to say about it. And white phosphorus is certainly a chemical weapon, as was Agent Orange and napalm that we used in Vietnam and never apologized for. So it's this type of hypocrisy, particularly from the liberal sector, from the academic sector, that is so annoying, and that we have felt as an organization supporting Palestinian rights for the past 20 years.
Okay. Well, moving on here a little bit, there was our mutual friend who hooked us together mentioned something about a big stink about a billboard.
Yes. When Donald Trump came to office, he came under the slogan of America First. And we at Dariusine Remembered made a billboard which said America First, not Israel.
Mm-hmm.
and we placed it with Lamar, which is one of the biggest billboard companies in the country, and it lasted 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, Lamar got so many complaints from the pro-Zionist people that they were forced to take the billboard down and refund our money. And then we went with Park, and they did the same thing. And we went with Adams, and they did the same thing. So here's a very simple message. It's only 4 words. America first, not Israel. And we have not been able to get that billboard back up. And by the way, we were paying $8,000 a month for the billboard. And they returned the money. That was fine. But it shows the immense power that the lobby has in the United States when you cannot get that kind of a message across in mainstream America. We've tried other billboards, and they too are largely rejected. The minute that the name Dariusine Remembered is associated with the billboard comes down. But, you know, it's the same as far as the USS Liberty is concerned. USS Liberty was an American spy ship, and in 1967, it was attacked for over 2 hours by Israel, and 34 Americans were killed. 173 were wounded. It became subsequently the most heavily decorated ship in the United States Navy. But the story of the USS Liberty is largely hidden.
Yes.
The men that were aboard that ship were told not to say anything about it for fear of losing their pension rights and their status in the military, and for fear of prosecution. And I really think that that's an outrage. In our
I
area,
agree. I agree.
We build a memorial. There's a memorial in Rochester, New York, on the harbor, to the men aboard the USS Liberty, and it's on public property, and it shows an image of the ship, and it tells some of the decorations of the gallant men that were on board. But the word Israel cannot be on that memorial. The person that looks at the memorial does not know who the perpetrator was, does not know who fired for over 2 hours on a largely defenseless ship and torpedoed the ship.
Yeah, they did. We're going to have to take another break for commercials. This one's going to be 4 minutes long, and then we'll be back with a large chunk of time to continue the discussion. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. We're talking with Dan McGowan, and we were talking about the USS Liberty. And actually, Dan, there is a plaque that was apparently sponsored by survivors of the USS Liberty attack, and I don't know exactly where it's located, but somebody sent me a picture of it, and it does mention that Israel was behind the attack on the Liberty. But, you know, the commanding officer, Captain McGonigal, got the Medal of Honor. It was the only Medal of Honor not awarded at the White House by the president. It was given to him in the Navy Yard. That's how hush-hush they wanted to keep this thing. And the fact that our government, President Johnson, McNamara, were colluding with Israel to basically keep this under wraps at the expense of these servicemen. And Israel's obvious goal was to sink the entire ship, leave no survivors. That's why they machine gunned the life rafts. And then I think they wanted to frame Egypt for the sinking to get the U.S. into the war against Egypt on Israel's side.
Well, that's true. And the plaque that you're speaking of is in Wisconsin.
Okay.
But the memorial that I was talking about was here in Rochester, New York. And in order to get that memorial on public property, they could not mention the name Israel. And we have a senator here in New York, Schumer, who is a media hound. He's on the news most every night. he did not and refused to attend the ceremony. This is a ceremony for 34 Americans, brave Americans, that were murdered. He didn't have any trouble going to ceremonies for the USS Cole, where 17 Americans were murdered by Arab terrorists. But when it came to Jews and Israelis attacking Americans, not just at one moment, but over a 2-hour period, Schumer couldn't come to that. And I think that that's outrageous, but it's indicative of the tremendous power that the lobby has in the United States. There's another
way too much power.
Of course,
way too much power.
Today we're talking a lot about BDS, which stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. Over half the states in the United States have enacted legislation to punish people who support BDS. Boycotting is as American as apple pie. I mean, what was the Boston Tea Party if it wasn't boycotting of English tea? Boycotting and urging sanctions is something that's very American. It's a very passive, non-aggressive type of protest, and that's punishable in New York State. If I support BDS, I can't work for the state of New York. And the same in Kansas, and the same in 25 of our states. Those laws have been enacted largely silently. Most of the public doesn't even realize that. But it's indicative of the tremendous power that the lobby exerts, and people who put Israel ahead of the United States exert in all of our states.
Well, boycotts are a recognized form of nonviolent protest, and as such, they're protected by the First Amendment. So I think somebody needs to pull together the resources to mount a challenge against all these state laws at the Supreme Court level. And I, for one, am tired of living under foreign puppet rule, which is what this really amounts to. We have a Vichy government in Washington, D.C. They're ruling this country for the benefit of a foreign power. The people of Iraq didn't like that. The people of Afghanistan didn't like that. The people of Libya don't like that. The people of Yemen don't like that. Why should we be any more accepting here in the United States?
That's right. And when Obama was the president, we have Netanyahu coming over to the United States, being invited to the United States Congress, and getting, it's unbelievable, 29 standing ovations for speaking against our president and the Iran policy, which was not just ours, but which is a joint policy with Great Britain and France and Germany and so forth. And here we have a foreign leader coming to the United States, coming to our Congress, and getting that kind of standing ovations is really unbelievable.
Well, AIPAC had people in the overhead gallery with camcorders, and the members of Congress were told ahead of time, if you don't stand up every single time, no more money from us for your next campaign. Much of the Israel lobby's power is its pocketbook. Much of that comes from the American taxpayer. What's really demonstrative of the lobby's power, there was a documentary made about the Israel lobby in Great Britain, and it got aired there, and it caused a huge upset and a stir. And then it turned out the same producers had done a documentary about the Israel lobby in the U.S. It has yet to be broadcast anywhere in this country. It's vanished, almost like the documentary about the Franklin scandal.
That's true. And our organization was actually involved in some of the smearing of Jeremy Corbyn, who was the labor leader in Great Britain. He was smeared as being anti-Semitic because he attended some of our events. And our events included speeches by rabbis and other prominent Jews, Mark Ellis and several other prominent Jewish voices for peace. But Jeremy Corbyn was criticized and labeled and smeared as anti-Semitic for attending Dariusine remembered ceremonies.
Well, I think Israel is on the verge of wearing that out. I mean, 10 years ago, if you were called an anti-Semite, you'd go into shock, you'd whip out your checkbook and throw money at them. Today, they've used it so much, it's almost like it's lost its shock value. And people say, oh, you're an anti-Semite. Well, if you say so, yeah, sure, no big deal. And I think that's probably a good thing because they've gone to that well way too many times. The problem, of course, is that in certain areas of endeavor like the media, if you're labeled an anti-Semite, it does have negative consequences for your career.
It certainly does. In some ways, you're right. It has the definition of anti-Semitism has somewhat changed from someone who hates Jews to someone who Jews hate. And
yes.
You are hated if you stand up for equal rights for Palestinians, and you are hated if you in any way criticize the Holocaust narrative, even though that's changed many, many times over history. You are hated if you talk about what they call the Holodomor, or the starvation, the mass starvation in the Ukraine and the Soviet Union in the 1930s, which was disproportionately represented by Jews, Jewish judges, Jews in the communist regime, the Bolsheviks, and so forth. If you mention that, then you are labeled and smeared as an anti-Semite. You will not get tenure. You'll most likely, there'll be some other excuse, but you will be thrown out of the academia, particularly here in the Northeast. But even in the Midwest, almost every country that had anything to do with World War II has been shaken down as somehow guilty for the Holocaust. The United States is accused of not bombing the rail lines into Auschwitz, which is arguably, we had no business bombing rail lines, and we would have killed a lot more people if we had. But we're blamed for that. We're blamed for not allowing people to disembark from the USS St. Louis. In every Holocaust museum across the country, you've got images of the St. Louis and the poor people that had to go back to Europe because they were not allowed to disembark in the United States. Germany, of course, is shaken down because of Hitler and the origins of World War II. But almost every other country, 10 years ago, it was the Swiss. The Swiss didn't return money that had been deposited in numbered bank accounts and so forth and so on. But today...
And now they're trying to shake down Poland.
Poland, of course, but they're shaking down the Mennonites. There was a conference that I attended 2 weeks ago in Bethel, at Bethel College, in just north of Wichita, and it was the third in a series on Mennonites and the Holocaust. They're going to shake down the Mennonites and make them atone for, and this is incredible, to atone for a few Mennonites who joined the Wehrmacht and a few Mennonites who even were in the SS. Of course, the whole history of the Mennonites being persecuted by the Bolsheviks, who were disproportionately led by Jews, that is ignored. You can't even mention that. But and the suffering of the Mennonites after at the end of World War II, from January of 1945 through the beginning of 1946, the Mennonites suffered horribly, often at the hands of Jews in Poland and the Ukraine and on into Germany, what was Eastern Germany and then Western Germany itself. That's ignored. That's totally ignored. But somebody found that there were a few Mennonites that in desperation joined the forces, sometimes as ancillary people, sometimes as perhaps as soldiers. Some at least one or two they found actually were in the SS. And so the whole Mennonite population is being shaken down, not so much for money, but to atone and to go to Israel and maybe to put up a memorial and maybe another Holocaust memorial or whatever. That's the bottom of the barrel. That's where we're coming to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they'll probably go along with it.
Yeah, probably. And it is amazing the grip that Israel has on all of these politicians. We're going to go ahead and take a phone call from Kathleen in Paris. Kathleen, aloha. Welcome to the show. Do you have a question for Dan?
Yes, yes, I do. Thank you. I heard something about Jews being expelled from many different places with some regularity. So I researched it a bit. And I have a list here of 109 locations where Jews have been expelled since the year 250 A.D. The first one being Carthage in 250 B.C. In fact, I'm going there in about a week to Carthage. But, and then, 100 or so years later, Jews were expelled from Alexandria. And then the next time was in the year 554. They're expelled from a region in France. And on and on, and on and on and on with some regularity, 109 of them. And the last one was 1948 on this list. I guess that would be the last one, wouldn't it? 1948.
Well, Israel likes to... point to all those expulsions as a record of their suffering and persecution throughout history.
Yes.
But if you look at the circumstances of all those expulsions, pogroms, what have you, there's only one common factor in them all, and that is the inability of the Jewish population to integrate and assimilate with the local culture. And that does tend to create a great deal of hostility when you have one. Yeah.
That was my question. I mean, why? Why would they be expelled? And not that, I mean, I'm looking at it like they did something. No group just gets kicked out 109 times through history for being agreeable.
Well, that's basically it, and the culture. And I know this because my first wife was Ashkenazi, and she shared all this stuff with me. They are taught by their religion that they're entitled to all the wealth of the world, and that anything that they can do to get it is blessed. The 10 Commandments don't apply to non-Jews. And so they don't have to deal with that prohibition, thou shalt not steal, and so forth and so on. And after a while, that kind of predatory behavior will get on people's nerves. And I think another example of that, of course, would be the Roma or the Gypsies, who had much of the same attitude issues, but obviously were not as successful in terms of acquiring their own country, other than Romania.
Now, they do also have no compulsion about stealing. They're mostly pickpockets. But that, what's the Fed? The pickpocket.
Well, the Gypsies have modernized and updated. I mean, they run parking lot topping scams, and I remember when we were living in Southern California, the media would warn us every time the Gypsies came to town to be on your guard. There would be all kinds of scams going on. Anyway, thank you for the phone call, Kathleen. We're going to let you go. We're coming up on a commercial break here, and I want to give Dan that final segment of the show. So very quickly, Janine in Florida, what did you want to add?
Yes, I just wanted to comment on his reference to the Mennonites being targeted. I don't know if he's aware that I think the real reason the Mennonites are being targeted is because so many different groups have joined Palestinian peace groups, such as something called Sabeel, And the Mennonites often went into Israel proper in order to escort children so they would be safe from settlers in the West Bank as well as other areas. And they finally were stopped at the airport, held in detention, and then put on the first plane back. The Mennonites have been at the forefront of fighting to defend the Palestinians. And I think that's why they are being targeted.
That's true.
Janine, I got to let you go. We're going to take another 3-minute commercial break, then back with the last segment of our program, and Dan McGowan. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And before we turn the microphone back over to Dan McGowan, a couple of quick breaking stories. Former President George Herbert Walker Bush has been taken to the hospital, and Israel has launched a missile strike against the Syrian army near the occupied Golan Heights. So getting on back to Dan, what do you see as the future of you and your organization? Where do you go from here?
Well, I think I don't think that that I will be successful in my lifetime, but the pendulum is turning, and it turns basically with Jews who recognize that to extol Jewish humanity and the ethical principles of Judaism, that is incompatible with the way people who support Israel are behaving. We have set up an organization called RighteousJews.org. You know, the Jews started this business in Holocaust museums of listing righteous Gentiles. And by a righteous Gentile, they mean that some non-Jewish person who helped save Jews during World War II. So paralleling that, we started an organization called Righteous Jews. And in order to be considered a righteous Jew, you have to be Jewish, and you have to accept one state with equal rights of citizenship, equal rights for all people living within the borders controlled by Israel. Mm-hmm. And an increasing number of Jews are coming to that realization that the creation of the State of Israel as a ethnocentric preference for Jewish people is antithetical to the principles of humanity and to the basic principles of prophetic Judaism. So that I think there will be a change. It won't come from pressure by non-Jews, because most non-Jews are completely kowtowed to the current discourse and the current vernacular that calls them anti-Semites and slimes them with Holocaust denial or some other nonsense. The change will come within the Jewish community itself. And we are calling these people righteous Jews, but really they're not very righteous. They just simply believe in a basic American principle, namely equal citizenship, equality among everyone living in a particular area.
Well, I got to tell you, I applaud Natalie Portman for taking a stand against what is happening down on that Gaza border.
Yes, her main objection was to Netanyahu itself, and she made it very clear that she did not support the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, but she did say, I'm not going to Israel because Netanyahu is so outrageous, and I'm not sharing a stage with him. And I do admire her for that.
Yeah, I do too. That takes a lot of courage. Even a star as prominent as her can still get blacklisted in Hollywood. Anyway, Dan, we have run out of time. Thank you for spending time with us today. We're going to have you back in the future. And thank you again for spending time with us. That's it for our show, folks. Please stay tuned for John Stadmiller. I'm sure he's got a lot of stuff to share with you. And please take what you learn here, share it with everyone that you know. Don't go over social media. It's all being filtered and blocked. Just talk to people or send them email and just get the word out. Keep RBN alive. Tell 5. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 3. And we're still trying to get in touch with our third hour guest. So let me get some more news in here while we're waiting for that. Now, the other day we reported on how the Democratic Party had purchased Hillary Clinton's email and voter data list for basically about $1.5 million. And now the Democrats are saying that Hillary really ought to donate that money back to the Democratic Party. She should just make it a gift for its use. The DNC has been left broke by Hillary's campaign and Obama's second campaign. All I can say on that one is good luck on that one. Hillary does not let money go easily. Meanwhile, and a good example of that came on out from this Washington State story where there was a donor to a Hillary Clinton nonprofit group. Onward Together is the group. It's a political action organization Hillary Clinton formed after she lost the 2016 election. And he wanted to cancel his regular monthly donation because the group disclosed very little information on how the money was being spent. And he went back to the website and discovered that nowhere in the website was there an option to discontinue your donations. Once you committed to the monthly payment, there's no way to cancel it. And so this Seattle man, Corey Kosielniak, I think that's how it's pronounced, has taken a complaint to the Washington State Attorney General's office. So you got to be careful when you look at a politician's website and make sure that you can get out of whatever it is they're trying to talk you into. Now, as you know, Elizabeth Warren has been the focus of a lot of controversy over claims that her genetic heritage includes Native American, part Cherokee. And apparently this goes back to 1980s when she entered this in a job database for law professors, and it actually helped her to get a job to claim that heritage. Well, now Native Americans are demanding that she prove that she actually is Cherokee. One of her opponents has put up billboards. He's an Asian Indian, and he's out there saying, you know, I'm a real Indian, and Elizabeth Warren is not. And Warren is refusing to take a DNA test. And that right there, to me, gives it away. She was lying all the time. Now there's a new player in there, Debbie White Dove Porrico, and she's an actual descendant of the 17th century Powhatan princess Pocahontas. We've all heard that name before. And she's now out there challenging Senator Elizabeth Warren to take a DNA test and prove her claimed Native American ancestry. And she says if it turns out Warren does have Native American ancestry, Debbie White Dove Porrico will be the first to welcome her to the heritage. But the fact that Warren has not done something so simple as do a DNA test tells us that, yeah, we find out these people lie a lot. Barack Obama lied about being a foreign student when he was in college to get additional financial aid and special perks. So once a liar, all a liar, I guess. Now, down in Texas, there's been a victory for common sense. The Texas Appeal Court has ruled that Texas can impose a voter ID requirement for the coming elections. And I hope that starts a movement in the other states, because remember, all during 2016, Hillary's lawyers, the DNC lawyers, were going to state after state after state, trying to find a judge who would declare the state's voter ID laws as unconstitutional or racist or some other such nonsense. And we know that millions of illegal immigrants voted in the 2016 elections, and unless there is a voter ID requirement, they will vote again in the November elections. So finally, some common sense out there. And it's not racist to want to see an ID. You have to have an ID to drive a car. All races get driver's IDs. It's a ridiculous argument. All right, we're finally being joined now by Alfonso E Chavez. Welcome to the show, Alfonso.
Mike, thank you for having me, and congratulations to you and Claire for an outstanding show.
Well, thank you very much. And you wrote me a letter a few days ago in which you told me a story. First of all, your parents are from Mexico. You are a legal U.S. citizen. And you had an interesting story about an experience your father went through. So why don't you just start at the beginning and just tell us all what happened?
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to share this story for a variety of reasons, but most importantly because of the recent events that we're witnessing transpire in Washington, D.C. And I would like to speak for a small group of people who have had the experience of dealing with something of this magnitude, specifically coming from the FBI and the DOJ, which very few people have experience with. And I figured it was time to write about this, more so because it had happened to us 12 years ago. So I want to be very clear. When I was 34 years old, my father was secretly embroiled in a secret claim against him brought to the FBI and the DOJ by what would be considered a whistleblower. So in ordinary speak, and just to give everyone a historical context, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln borrowed some laws from England that are called the Keatem Laws, and they're now known by historians as the Lincoln Laws. Later on in the 70s and in the 80s, they became what's now known as the False Claim Act. Nevertheless, these laws have been on the books since 1863, and they were enacted in an attempt by Lincoln to go after people that were selling him bad donkeys or bad munitions or any other article that was being used by the Union at that time to support the war. And essentially what Lincoln did, to the detriment of all of us today, is that he deputized every single attorney to sue anyone for any reason at any time in the name of the king as for himself. I'm going to say this again very slowly. The Keatem Laws that were brought by Abraham Lincoln to this country, that were on the books, state, and I quote, Keatem pro domino regiquam pro se ipso in hoc parte sequitur, meaning he who sues in this matter for the king as well as for himself. This was an abomination, a legal and constitutional abomination for a sitting president to deputize every single lawyer and give them the power of the federal government to sue anyone at any time for any reason. Now, lo and behold, my father, a physician, came to this country legally with my mother, married, had 3 children. I was born in Minnesota. We moved to Chicago. We moved to Houston. He finished his medical specialization at Baylor. We ended up in El Paso, Texas. At the age of 62, he started his medical practice at the age of 34. Imagine how many years of schooling he had to go through to be able to start his practice at 34. Now at the age of 61, almost 62, someone decides to accuse him of Medicare fraud. Secretly. There's no knock on the door. There's no phone call. There isn't someone sending us an email saying, hey, we think someone did something wrong here. We need to investigate. We need to look at this. It's not the way these people work. And at this time, lo and behold, Robert Mueller was the director of the FBI. This was Mueller's FBI. Okay. This was 2006. So this case starts, and it lasted for 2,136 days. I'll translate that. 5.85 years. 52,000 hours. 305 weeks. I can give you the math and we can break it down. I don't think anyone understands how incredibly vexatious and repressive the FBI and the DOJ are, and how incredibly difficult it is to be able to withstand that kind of of action against you. And when I was watching this entire circus unfold with Donald Trump and what they were doing to go against him with the appointment of the special counsel, all of this flooded back to this experience that we had 12 years ago. And nothing has changed, Mike. Nothing has changed. Yes? And with regard to all of this, you have to think, who can withstand any of this? And so I want to make a couple quick points. There is a legal jurisprudence notion called animus nascendi. This is a term coming from Latin that essentially means animus, mind, nascendi, to harm, right? There has to be some form of intent to harm in the minds of the FBI or the DOJ to go after anyone, a normal citizen, whether it be a doctor, whether it be a nurse, a school teacher, whether it be the President of the United States, whether it be a radio host. It doesn't matter. Very few people can withstand the entire full frontal force of the FBI and DOJ going after you. We happen to be one of the families, one of the few families that survived. Not only did we survive it, I'm perhaps one of the few guys in the U.S. that has beaten Robert Mueller at his game. And how we did that is a complicated and very interesting story in and of itself. But for today's purposes, I wanted to point out to your viewers and to your listeners some very simple points. And I'll make one right now in a very simple way. The Vice President of the United States makes $243,500 a year. After 24% taxes, that's about $59,000. He's left with $185,000 left in his salary. At the legal rates right now, if the entire weight of the Mueller investigation were against Mike Pence, that would mean that at an hourly rate of $1,500 an hour for one lawyer, Mike Pence could afford, on 1 year vice presidential salary, 123 hours of legal counsel. That's 15 days of legal service. And he's the Vice President of the United States. What do you think would have happened if anyone else would have won the presidency? That wasn't a billionaire, that didn't have almost unlimited resources to be able to defend himself against a false accusation like we did. No one came to our defense. None of the insurance companies covered my father's defense. Not even the companies or the medical, the billionaire companies that were involved or entrenched in the case as well. The entire weight of his defense and our family defense rested on our family's ability to be able to defend ourselves. Does that sound familiar? Does that not sound like a Second Amendment issue of having to defend yourself against tyranny? Now, how many people, including the Vice President of the United States, could afford to be able to go against Mueller with only 15 days of money to do it? It's unbelievable. Complete violation of our Sixth Amendment, which is part of our Constitution, which essentially breaks down our right to a speedy trial. Absolute violation of our 14th Amendment, which is a due process issue, let alone, a handful of others as well. And so as we discuss this topic and we have this conversation as a nation and as people, I think that we need to be incredibly sensitive to not only the issues that we have in the healthcare arena with regard to having to nationalize healthcare. Who can afford to get cancer? Who can afford to weather one cancer in a family, let alone 2 or 3 or 4? Who can afford to be accused falsely of anything? What happened to the civility afforded to us by our founders in reference to giving us the ability to due process? I would tell you as of today, yes? And this, again, is probably going to shock many of your viewers, right? Even though the FBI interceded on behalf of a whistleblower, which was based on entirely false claims, the FBI and the DOJ withdrew from our case 444 days after it was brought before a secret filing in a federal court. In other words, 444 days after the case was filed in federal court secretly, the FBI and the DOJ basically went off to the sideline. That didn't mean they withdrew, but the government did not actively participate in the case. This is in the case law, and if anyone wanted to see it, it's public record. They could find the case and they can read it for themselves. But that doesn't mean they stopped. The prosecutors that had been deputized, yes, Mr. Dumb and Mr. Dumber, a law firm out of El Paso, Texas, and another one out of Las Cruces, New Mexico, yes, thought that they were going to win the lottery. Why? Because they get 30% of the pie, Mike. 30% of the pie. How many people would like 30% of, in our case, $303 million? And to make matters more interesting, if anyone remembers the Aaron Brockovich case, that case settled for $333 million. At the time, this case was brought forward against a Mexican physician working in El Paso who had spent his entire life serving the public and, in fact, was owed money by Medicare when all was said and done, right? Did the FBI ever step in to say, hey, you know what? Something went wrong here. We're now going to protect your father. We're going to go against these lawyers who try to hoodwink us. We're going to go against this whistleblower who fabricated these claims. We're going to go against the people that have lied to us. Absolutely not. And does that sound familiar? Has anyone done anything to go after Bernie Madoff's people? Yes? Or anyone else? And I think we've asked this question on other shows as well. I think you brought this up too. When in the history of the United States has anyone, any criminal actor's lawyer's office been raided? Was Al Capone's lawyer's office raided? Was John Gotti's lawyer's office raided? Was Bernie Madoff's lawyer's office raided? Never. Were any of these lawyers who attacked my father for the incredulous reason of getting rich, right, to make 30% off the purse in the hope that my father and the medical companies that they dragged into this would settle the case, right? Did any of these people get their offices raided? No. Even after it was discovered in our case, which was historic, what made this case historic was that in the 148 years of federal court, specifically relating to these kinds of trials, which are called Ketam trials, never had a jury of 12 people found a defendant not guilty in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. That was one of the reasons the lawyers appealed that case after losing it to the Fifth Circuit in Louisiana. So not only did we have to spend a massive amount of time and money getting a full-on not guilty verdict in a federal court in Texas, we had to then go and defend ourselves in the appellate court in the Fifth Circuit in Louisiana for another 3 years, lasting a total of 2,136 days. So I ask everyone, how much longer could anyone deal with a guy like Mueller on their back? How long is this going to last? 4 years? 5 years? 8 years? And is this the way we're going to operate? There's got to be a better way of dealing with this. And this was the conversation I wanted to start. Because we cannot have a country that weaponizes the FBI and DOJ to act in criminal manners. It's not possible. And again, it breaks my heart that this happened to us. And it breaks my heart that this is happening across this country to a bunch of other people as well. We're not the only family, right? So where was CNN? Do you think CNN cared to come down to El Paso, Texas and talk to my father? Do you think the New York Times or the Washington Post or anyone cared to interview us? In fact, we reached out to them. We reached out to them because at the time...
Alfonso, I'm sorry to cut you off, but we have to take a commercial break, and it's going to be 3 minutes long, and I'll come right back to you as soon as the commercials are over. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. We're still talking with Alfonso E Chavez, who's just painted this nightmare scenario of the weaponization of the FBI and the Department of Justice, and also the legal system by literally offering bounties to lawyers to go on out and sue people. It's like the witch hunts in Europe. The professional witch hunters were paid a portion of the accused and condemned witches' property. And so, of course, they saw witches everywhere, which sort of gets me to my next point I want to make. My understanding is that the final audit of the Medicare documentation from your father's practice showed that he was actually owed money by Medicare, that he hadn't defrauded them, and yet these lawyers still went ahead trying to prosecute the case to try and get all of the defendants to agree to an out-of-court settlement. And thank goodness that your father decided he was going to, fight for his integrity and his honor. But then to try and take it to an appeals court again, very obviously these lawyers were motivated by the money and nothing else. And I think there should have been complaints to the State Bar Association. Not that the State Bar Associations ever do anything to lawyers. We went through that with the lawyer that handled my mother's estate years ago, and he literally tried to steal the house. And we filed a complaint with the Bar Association. He got a wrist slap, and that was that. But it's important to understand. There's even a term for it now. It's called lawfare. And that's where you sick your lawyers on each other to try and bankrupt the other party. It's almost like lawyers have become the modern-day equivalent of the hired gunfighter.
Exactly, Mike. And I've had extensive interactions with different bar associations. In fact, I've been living in California for now 18 years, and I hope that the rest of the country that's hearing this knows that there still is hope in California. There are several of us here that are fighting for the rule of law and to keep our sanity. Very often I hear a wonderful caller by the name of Peter call in to make some incredible points. And so there are several of us that are here fighting. I know that it might seem to the Midwest that California's lost. We're not lost just yet, but things are very difficult here. To that point, I want to reference you to Senator Joe Dunn. Senator Joe Dunn of California is in fact a whistleblower against the California bar. This is a very famous case. In fact, his lawyer was Mark Garagos. I spoke to Joe Dunn. He was active in parts of my case, and other cases I've had here in California. But nevertheless, I would invite you guys to Google him and to see what he was trying to do to try to expose the corruption of the California bar. And I will absolutely agree 100% that the majority of the bar associations are paratoids. They're malignant tumors gone bad. And so when you look at the conspiracy, and there's a RICO argument to be made in the conspiracy between the DOJ and everyone else. Yes, a very interesting point that I would like to make is this, and I invite everyone to go to the FBI website. And on their FAQ on their website today reads the following. What authority do FBI agents have to make arrests in the United States, its territories, or on foreign soil? Answer. In the U.S. and its territories, FBI special agents may make arrests for any federal offense committed in their presence or when they have reasonable grounds to believe that the person to be arrested has committed or is committing a felony violation of U.S. laws. Now, I want that to sink in for a second. That means that given the rules today, any FBI agent can act on his or her own volition to arrest anyone at any time, given a suspicion of a crime or the grounds that they believe that the person to be arrested has committed or is committing a felony of a U.S. law. Where in the hell are these 30,000 agents that we have working for us today, and why in the hell are they not going out and arresting their own kind? The same people that are hiding the criminalities of the people that we elected to serve us. If it were up to me, I would argue that there should be about 1,500 agents in Washington alone who should have walked into the 7th floor building of the FBI headquarters and arrested half of those clowns on their own volition. They have the right to do it. They don't need to get permission from anyone. They're not a military agency where they have to take orders from a general. They have special powers. That's why they're called special agents. Now, if anyone disagrees with this, then maybe we need to review the FAQ on the FBI. Maybe they made a mistake, right? Maybe they don't have that authority. But from what I'm reading in black and white and what I've known since 2006 is that they do. This was the problem that I had with agents in El Paso, Texas. I kept saying, why are you not going after the bad guys? You have the authority to do it. And they would just wash their hands and walk away. This is the fundamental crux of the issue, right? For whatever reason, everyone thinks that they need to be given an order from God knows where to be able to do their job. Imagine if police officers in every single state had to wait to get an order to give you a speeding ticket. Where would we be?
Okay. Alfonso, we got to take another break for commercials. They're kind of oddly spaced on out. We'll be back in 4 minutes and continue with your story. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. We're talking with Alfonso E Chavez. He's been telling us this horror story of what appears to have been a purely profit-driven prosecution of his father. We know that the real nature of the FBI is not what we see on TV and movies. That's all carefully crafted to give you a public image that the FBI are the good guys. And that was something that J. Edgar Hoover obsessed about when he was in charge of the FBI. There was even a movie made called The FBI Story starring Jimmy Stewart. And you can forget about the director's name in the credits because Hoover was actually on the soundstage every day telling the director how to make the FBI look as good as possible. He even appears briefly in the movie, but only from the backside. We all know from COINTELPRO, that scandal back in the 60s was exposed in the 70s. We all know what the real nature of the FBI is. They're the American equivalent of the Gestapo. They are there to enforce the desires of the rulers, and they're not really all about law enforcement at all. They're about covering up. They're about framing people. They're about blacklisting, people out of Hollywood over Vince Foster and that kind of a situation. So to most of our listeners, your story is not going to be that much of a surprise. But I think anybody who would be honestly thinking about trying to arrest one of these untouchable, corrupt players is going to have to realize what happened to Seth Rich, and that may be cooling their enthusiasm.
Absolutely, Mike, and we're living in dangerous times. I mean, clearly, it took us a long time to get over the naivety that we had, just in reference to thinking that the FBI and that the government was really there to protect us. I mean, my parents came to this country with a grandiose ideal of American jurisprudence, and I think that to a certain degree, most people in the world would envision or feel that the U.S. Judicial system is perhaps one of the most advanced or fairest in the world, when in fact it isn't. And it's a shock to the system. It's almost like discovering that Santa Claus doesn't exist when you're a kid, right? You feel that the government is here to protect you and to protect the weakest of you or the weakest of us, which is essentially the tenet of the Constitution, right? You would think that the weakest among us is the person that most needs protection, yes, which is why, to a certain degree, our judicial system is comprised of jurors, or should be, right, with the exception of family courts, and don't get me started with that, right? Yeah, they've strategically removed the jury component that was afforded through the Constitution, specifically due process. The due process.
Well, they're starting to do that in a lot of situations where if the value involved in a crime involving theft is below a certain level, they won't get you a jury trial. And that's a very, very dangerous trend because those jurors are the highest authority in the judicial system. They're there to guard against malicious, profit-driven prosecutors, as you had in your case, or corrupt judges, or judges who are trying to enforce bad law. That's what the jurors are there for. They're the final check and balance. And if we start losing those, then it really does become a kangaroo court and a dictatorship.
And in California, I don't know if anyone is aware of this, but in California specifically, the Los Angeles Superior Court, which is one of the largest court systems in the world, the LA Superior Court, which is in downtown LA, has a yearly budget, Mike, of $2 billion. $2 billion. And they're bankrupt. Wow. You cannot get a court transcriptionist unless you pay for it. Let me say that again. They don't have court transcriptionists in court anymore unless you can afford one and you order one before your hearing or trial. How many people do you think go through the system a day? And based on the statistics I was given, in the Los Angeles Superior Court alone, there are approximately 100,000 cases filed a day. This is the court of Michael Jackson, Kim Kardashian, the McCourts, everyone else in L.A. that gets processed for whatever reason. Yes, they go to the L.A. Superior Court in downtown L.A. How many people, Mike, do you think can afford to pay a court transcriptionist or even know what that is? So imagine you don't have a jury. Now you don't have a court transcriptionist, and you're at the mercy of a judge. It is unbelievable. And here we have the FBI that is supposed to deal with these kinds of issues. Don't you think that the FBI should be able to come in and say, hey, Mr. Court System, what's wrong with your finances? How could you be bankrupt? You're the seventh, California is the seventh largest economy in the world, perhaps the eighth, and you can't afford court transcriptionists? So essentially, when you think about it, very similar to the healthcare phenomena where no one has the right to get sick anymore because you can't afford to get sick. You can't afford to have a legal issue. And this is the crisis that we're living in. And so part of my inspiration, on top of the fact that I love what you guys are doing, and you're doing phenomenal work day in and day out, to much sacrifice, because I know that you're not, you guys are struggling, and we should all find the opportunity to help programs like yours and independent journalists and advocates like yours who love this country. We all love this country. I love this country. I have 3 kids who love this country. But I am horrified at the day one of my children either gets sick or has a legal issue, because either of those circumstances will potentially kill them. It is unfathomable to think that any of us can support or have to be able to fight against those kinds of demonic situations. It's just not possible.
Well, medical bills are the leading cause of personal bankruptcies in the United States right now. And we have the most expensive medical care in the world. It's something like 33rd or 34th in quality, and it's all about pushing product. And it's a totally corrupted system. It's all about the money.
It is. Food for thought. Who remembers in 1993 when Bill Clinton asked over 90 attorney generals to resign? And I guess we can remind the audience that Reagan did something similar. Do you think Bill Clinton, what would have happened to Trump or any president today had he asked 90 attorney generals to resign? It's incredible.
At the time, it was basically predicated that, Clinton did have the right to fire them all and appoint new ones. But in hindsight, it was clearly a case of wanting control over the state's attorneys generals in order to forestall certain investigations and prosecutions.
Exactly. And then everyone I'm assuming saw the movie American Made with Tom Cruise and can get a better idea as to what was going on in those Clinton days. But the moral of the story here is this: in any of these scenarios, right, the first line of defense and the last line of defense are the agencies that are there to protect the people, right? When I grew up idealizing the FBI, right? Mm-hmm. They could do no wrong, right? My parents were oblivious, perhaps maybe even naive to the fact that they thought that the Justice Department and that the FBI knew. When this entire thing happened, and I guess this is a very important point, I don't want it to get missed, all of the billing in 2006 that at least we were doing in the office, about 90% of it was electronic billing. We were sending bills electronically to Medicare and Medicaid. And so at that point in time, when this happened, we thought, okay, there's a misunderstanding, right? I don't know, maybe someone, a file got corrupted, something got lost along the way, someone, messed up a digit here or there. We'll figure it out, right? We were still optimistic in the sense of looking at this as perhaps just a big miscommunication or some misinformation. Once we started digging into it, and we started expecting the FBI to know the truth, we just kept waiting. We kept waiting and waiting and waiting, thinking that one day they were going to knock on our door and say, okay, we figured it out, right? Now we know the truth because we have all of the electronic medical records. Mike, the FBI raided the clinics. They didn't come in and knock on the door. They raided the clinics just like they raided Manafort's home and office, just like they raided Cohen's office. They raided with guns drawn. with battering rams, right? Dogs, the whole thing. This was not a friendly, exchange of civility, right? It was brutal. Now, even after having had that experience, we said, okay, they're following protocol, they're FBI agents, they're on the lower end of the totem pole, maybe they don't know what they're doing, maybe they're 1, 2, 3 years into the field, whatever, right? But as we kept looking at this issue, we realized that it was systemic. The corruption was systemic. And whether they knew or they didn't know, they were not moving a finger to help anyone. In fact, all of their energy and effort was going to support a false claim against an innocent man. And that is the tragedy here. It goes unbeknownst to anyone. What's going to happen if Trump is found not guilty? What if Trump wins this whole thing? What's going to happen? What is his recourse? What's going to happen to Mueller? Is he going to get to go to jail? Is Rosenstein get to go to jail? What about Sessions? Yes, who is going to be held accountable for having dragged him through the mud just like they dragged us through the mud? And at the end of the day, who is going to make reparations to indemnify the President of the United States for this big waste of time and money and effort? Yes, what about the countless other families that have been dragged through the mud for the same reason with no accountability? Not even a we're sorry. Not even, and let me be clear, not even a public we're sorry. No one from the DOJ went on the podium or a stand or on television to say, we're exonerating Dr. Chavez, or we're exonerating the Chavez family, or God knows how many other people, right? There wasn't an apology letter. Nothing. Zero. And to make matters clear to everyone, zero financial indemnification. Not one penny came back, even after the courts in Louisiana, the Fifth Circuit, held the verdict. And this was the most shocking part of it. When we discovered in court, in trial, during the federal trial, when they discovered that the whistleblower had in fact committed perjury through the attorneys in what was defined as sublimation of perjury. So let me translate that. Sublimation of perjury is when the lawyers tell the witness to lie or instruct the witness to change his or her testimony to make their case better in court. Had that not come out on the bench while the witness was being interrogated by opposing counsel, this case, God knows where we would have ended up in this case. That was the tipping point when one of the attorneys, and there were about 20 of them in the room, yes, not all representing my father. My father had about 4 attorneys of the 20, yes, but of the attorneys that were there, one of them was lucky enough to get the witness to admit that she had falsified her testimony. And at that point, when they counter-examined her, and they said, "Who told you to change your testimony in your dicta?" she admitted that her lawyer had told her. And at that point, the judge threw the gavel down, kicked everyone out of the courtroom, took everyone into chambers, and the next day, everything changed. But that was a Hail Mary moment. It was a miraculous moment that happens rarely in the history of court trials, where you get a witness on the stand to be dumb enough to say, "Hey, my lawyer told me to lie to make the case look better." Right? And at that point...
Okay, Alfonso, I need to interrupt here a little bit. We've got a caller on the line who wants to ask you a question. So let's bring Chris from Tampa in on the discussion. Chris, you have a comment or question for Alfonso?
On the importance of court reporters, pardon me, I'm just trying to understand what the importance is myself, and if you could expand on what I understand is that it makes the court a court of record and makes certain issues that are brought up verbally appealable. That's why it's important to put things in writing if possible. If you can't afford a stenographer, a court reporter. And I found recently that in a civil case that most court reporters won't work for individuals. They'll only work for attorneys. I even called up one that would work for me as an individual, and gave them the information that of the court date. And then I received an invoice emailed to me, so I had to deny that because I told them I didn't choose you yet. I wasn't interested in your services yet. And the case actually was canceled. The hearing was actually canceled. Now, stenographers can't understand every word. Their vocabulary isn't omniscient. Their transcriptions are flawed. And we should be allowed to record. In Florida here, we have the Sunshine Law, where all public officials, in the course of their public duties, are allowed to be recorded, even if they're not informed they're being recorded. But, of course, the courts are an exception. So why can't we record and make our own transcripts? Court reporters, I've found in many cases, omit vital parts of transcripts, which makes it obvious that their omissions are deliberate. So I just wanted you to expand on that. If you had any more to add, please.
Sure, I completely agree. I've been involved in a myriad of cases where court reporters have doctored or changed the dicta of the judge to favor the judge. Very often judges will misspeak or they'll say things that are inappropriate or perhaps maybe even illegal. And the court reporters will change it because it's within their best interest to serve the court, right? They don't want to get fired from their job, and they have an interest in maintaining a copious record to please the court, in other words, the judge. I've had many issues with that, and I completely agree with you. I think that it should be our right, de facto, across the country, all 50 states, for all of us to be able to record. In federal court, however, it is an abomination. You can't even walk in with a cell phone. In fact, you can't even walk in with a camera in most cases. And I'll remind everyone in the audience that very often when you see depictions of court trials, you're going to see illustrations by guys that have pencils and paper because they can't even walk in there with a camera. I'm hoping all of that will change. And again, an excellent advocacy point for all of us to work on together to try to make those changes because we have to protect ourselves. We cannot depend on anyone to do it for us. Okay, well, fine.
Thank you.
And Chris, we're going to let you go here. We're coming up on our final commercial break for the show. I think it's important that we just keep repeating the important part. There had been no Medicare, Medicaid fraud committed by your father. When they finished the audit, he was actually owed money, and still these prosecutors pursued this case in the hope of a settlement and a payout. That's not a justice system. That's a just us system. Got to take a 3-minute break here. We'll be back with the last segment of our program after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Last segment of our program today. We're finishing up here with Alfonso E Chavez, who's just told this horrific story of the abuse of the justice system. Alfonso, we have about 4 minutes until the end of the show. What would you like to share with our listeners?
I'd like to reemphasize this point that we've been making throughout the show, that there is a possibility of a call to action by all of us to remind the FBI agents, the good ones that are left, and I'm hoping that there's some good ones left out there, that it's within their purview to take matters into their own hands. This idea that they need to be given orders from above is non-existent. The way I read the law, my understanding of protocol and procedure is that each one of these agents, no matter whether they're the first day on the job or they've been there for 30 years, each of these agents is entrusted to uphold and defend the Constitution of this United States of America. They have every single authority to arrest anyone at any time, including their brothers and their sisters at the FBI. Now, if they want to fight about it afterwards, God bless them, because there's due process. Anyone that gets arrested is going to be afforded due process. But the responsibility is in the hands of each of these agents who's been entrusted to defend our Constitution, Mike. And if they do not do their job and start changing the culture of the FBI to go after anyone that is in violation of our laws and is a traitor to this country on many different levels, then I think you're right. I think we've lost hope. And that includes the warmongers, right, and everyone in between. If you go to the website of the FBI, and this was fascinating. I did this to research. I just did this yesterday in preparation for this show. The FBI's website lists only six cases only 6 cases which they deem to be historic in their entire 110 years of existence. And as a quick note, the FBI was founded in part by Charles Bonaparte, the great-grandnephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was an attorney general. Fantastic, piece of history which we can discuss or debate at a different time. But if you go to the FBI website today, the 6 cases that are there are 1, February 1980, the Abscam case, March 1984, Operation Greylord, June 1988, Operation Illwind, April 2008, Tennessee Waltz, June 1972, Watergate, and 2005, the William Jefferson case. So what the FBI is telling us in their marketing effort on their website is that in the entire 110 years of their history, these are their milestone cases. You've got to be kidding me. You're talking about 3 cases from the 80s, 1 from 1972, right, and 2 from 2005 to 2008. This is what they have to be proud of? That's it? So either there's something wrong here, or they're not doing enough of what they should be doing every single day. If you just look at what happened,
what they're doing can't be talked about. I mean, they're back to the same tactics they used during COINTELPRO, and they're not going to make that public. Again, the FBI is the American version of the Gestapo.
Right.
And there's the music. So, Alfonso, it was a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for sharing the information, that history of your father's lawsuit. Again, thank you for being on the show today. We're going to let you go here. The music is now playing. It's time for me to get out of here and get something useful done with the rest of the day. Stay tuned for John Stadmiller. He's got lots of interesting things to share with you. Please take what you learn here and share it with everybody. Talk to people. Use email. Use postal mail. Forget about social media. It's being turned into a giant wall of filters. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.
God bless you, Mike. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.